This is the road more traveled, a look at putting DevOps transformation back on the rails. My name is George Miranda. I'm a director of product marketing at Chef. I've been at Chef for about 5 years now, and when I first started at Chef, I was doing a lot of consulting and field work, which means that I've gotten to work with some of our largest and most successful customers in various phases of their DevOps transformation. So it's been very interesting for me to see where they were when I first met them versus where they are today. If you've hung out with me in the field and you've met me, you probably know that I'm a big fan of being an agent for change. And if we haven't met each other, what I'll say is that change is a constant theme in my life that extends well beyond just the scope of technology. For example, just in my time at Chef, I've lived in 3 different cities alone, let alone all my time on the road, and I like to bounce around from place to place to look at a lot of different settings. I grew up in Los Angeles. Anybody here from SoCal? One person? All right, cool. You're my people. You'll probably know where this story is going next. But for everybody else, I'll say this. Los Angeles is a very, very dynamic city, and the downtown area of Los Angeles has just undergone its own radical transformation initiative. When I was living in Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles was known for this. It was known as Skid Row, right? And it's not the sort of place you wanted to be after dark. I mean, sure, there was bustling daytime commerce, but come 5 p.m., you cleared out of there because it was nothing but bad news. And there were some very tumultuous things going on in the city at the time, and city leaders realized that the only way for Los Angeles to evolve and move forward was to radically change how their city was structured. But the question became, how do you drive change on this sort of scale? And LA is a really massive enterprise, right? The scale of Los Angeles is about 13 million residents with an estimated $750 billion of revenue, right? That's $750 billion. That's a massive enterprise. But if you look at the state of downtown Los Angeles today, it's almost unrecognizable. It's completely transformed. Downtown LA is now known for being Gallery Row, right? It's a booming economy. It attracts a set of diverse professionals from all over the globe to live there. It's a beacon of creativity in the city, a center for arts and nightlife. And there's a real estate boom going on in downtown Los Angeles that is unlike anything that they've seen since the 1920s. So more growth than they've almost seen in over a century, right? Like, how did they pull off that transformative magic, and how do I get me some of that? It's mind-boggling in terms of complexity and scope, because when you drive transformation, you have to figure out how you fundamentally transform every moving part of it. And when it comes to a city like Los Angeles, right, that means that you are coordinating the needs of a diverse set of groups with diverse goals, right? Whether they're real estate developers or investors, right, transportation, merchants, big business employers, right, public safety, environmental impact, like the list just goes on and on and on. So how do you get transformation at the scale of Los Angeles, right? How are you able to push that throughout the entire organization? What do? Do you set up a very small focused task force that has maybe 2 visionaries on it and like a super sharp project manager with an amazing Kanban board, filter all change through them, and then suddenly we'll drive this transformation throughout the city? Like, no, right? Like, I see some smiles. That sounds ridiculous, right? It sounds even ludicrous to say out loud. But if I talk about transforming a Fortune 500 IT organization, like, I'm starting to see some nodding heads, right? Like, that sounds about right because that's what we see many times. So why is the former absolutely ridiculous, but not the latter? Like, what lessons can we learn about DevOps transformation happening on that scale, right? What can we learn about replicating these types of successes inside our own organizations? Here's what I found when I was getting ready for this talk. In my search, I discovered that there are now cities around the world that are trying to replicate the same success as downtown Los Angeles. And whether that's domestic cities like Atlanta, Savannah, Nashville, or international cities, Bogota, Delhi, Copenhagen has done some really interesting things. Cities are now trying to figure out how they drive wide-scale transformation. It was really eye-opening to me to see what some of the parallels were. So cities that have successfully done this realize that they cannot be a central bottleneck for change. Instead, they need to decentralize expertise and make it clear what their priorities are. So cities that successfully transform do it by setting up self-reinforcing cycles that start with identifying the right metrics. The way to drive transformation through a $750 billion economy is to start by focusing on things like this. So this slide is pretty interesting because the metrics at the top feed the outcomes at the bottom. And it's kind of surprising when you first look at some of these metrics, like what the hell do one-way streets versus two-way streets have to do with vitality, vibrancy, and resiliency, right? And when you start to unpack it, you see, well, one-way streets are really great for funneling traffic through a downtown area, but they're really terrible for generating foot traffic. And if you don't have strong foot traffic, you're not gonna have strong retail in that neighborhood. And you need strong retail to drive neighborhood revenues. If you have strong neighborhood revenues, you can attract higher rent. If you have higher rent prices, you have developers that want to build more housing units that bring in more residents and feed the entire cycle and keep it going, right? Also, that foot traffic creates a sense of neighborhood and community, and that's really necessary when you fall on hard economic times, as neighborhoods inevitably do, and you need to have some resiliency to make it through, right? And then you support those behaviors with infrastructure, in this case, the way that people get around, right? By changing the way that people get around, you create daily behaviors that reinforce the cycle and make those daily behaviors into habits. So that one seemingly arbitrary metric has a world of innovation attached to it when you start to unpack what it means to actually deliver on that number. So the way to succeed in DevOps transformation is to set up self-reinforcing cycles in your own organizations. And you do that two ways. One, you start by identifying the right metrics that matter. And two, you put in tools that reinforce the behaviors that you want to see on a daily basis. Setting up those self-reinforcing cycles is the only way to scale communication and drive culture change across a diverse set of teams with a diverse set of goals. So that's what we're going to talk about today, right? We're going to talk about metrics, tools, and the science of change. Oh, and I almost forgot, we're going to do it with one more thing, right? So the title of this talk, The Road More Traveled, that's a Robert Frost reference, right? To the road less traveled. Do we have any poetry fans or English majors, literary geeks in the room? Like a couple folks. All right, anybody know what's wrong with what I just said? I think I heard it. So the title of the talk is, or sorry, the title of the poem is incorrect, right? It's not The Road Less Traveled or The Road More Traveled. It's actually The Road Not Taken. And I think the only thing that's mistaken more often than the name of that poem is the sentiment behind it, right? Everybody know the poem that I mean? Two roads diverged in the woods and I took the one less traveled by, right? So that poem, when you read it, the two roads are essentially the same. Like there's no discernible difference, and it actually doesn't matter which one the author chooses. And so the poem is actually commentary about the stories that we tell ourselves to justify the decisions that we've made. And so I see that happen a lot in transformation initiatives, which is you hear stories about some decisions that worked in one organization but don't work in others, and there's a lot of anecdotes that maybe potentially steer us the wrong way. So instead, we're going to take the road more traveled, right? Which means we're going to look at empirical data, we're going to look at objective observations, and we're going to identify what actually works in proven paths to success. Sound like a deal? Cool. All right, so identifying the right metrics. I got this next part from Dr. Nicole Forsgren. If you're watching this talk, hey, Nicole, what's up? So Nicole used to work at Chef. She now works at DORA, DevOps Research and Assessment. And she's kind of my hero when it comes to the science of metrics and how that shapes behaviors. If you really want to get into it and dive deep, I think she does a way better job than I ever could about how you science the crap out of DevOps. So she has some really wonderful talks on that. I suggest looking them up if you want to go deep. But this next part is a really good summary, and it comes from Eli Goldratt, author of The Goal. Right? And he writes this: "Tell me how you measure me, and I will tell you how I will behave." The breakdown is basically this, right? You should always measure the things that matter because that's how you communicate priorities, right? If you don't measure it, it probably doesn't matter, right? If you don't measure it, don't expect anyone to do anything about it. And in business, this usually plays out because our incentives are tied to certain measurable goals, right? And the most obvious example of this is in sales, right? You close a deal this certain way and you get paid. And so in business, especially, we tend to orient around behaving in ways that achieve our incentives. So measures are important because they drive our behaviors. But, right, individual measures have a way of maybe leading to unintended consequences if you just look at them in isolation. And so the example of that is this, right? If you define a metric that says we're going to ship X new features to users every week, then you can expect that the behavior that you're going to get from that is that your developers are going to sprint to get X number of features into the release every Friday, right? And is that necessarily the right thing to do? Maybe, right? Maybe X is the right number, maybe it isn't. But it has an unintended consequence in that this might be setting you up for a support nightmare, right? Maybe those features aren't fully ready to go, but the thing that matters is getting X number out there, right? And so maybe you deliver things that aren't fully baked. Or maybe you sprint to get those in at 5 p.m. before everybody goes home, and then your ops and support teams are cleaning that up over the weekend, right? But hey, like, I got those features out, like, high five, bro, good job, right? Metric achieved. And so what happens is we inadvertently set up situations where people strive to deliver on those one metrics that we've defined, right, or those few metrics we've defined, consequences be damned. And consequences aren't damned out of malice, right? Consequences are damned because we're not measuring them, right? We didn't communicate that they're actually important. And teams will optimize for their given constraints, right? So unintended consequences slip through the cracks because we didn't decide to measure them or track them. And because of that, some organizations take the exact opposite approach, right? They'll go ahead and measure everything, right? And so if you do that and you go that route, you have a way of creating a lot of noise from which it's very difficult to extract a signal. So the key is really to identify a small set of metrics that, when taken together, start creating a self-reinforcing web of behaviors that shield you from unintended consequences. And what I found that was astonishing when I started looking at how cities transform is that a number of cities that are now going down the transformational path manage to drive large-scale change with only about a dozen or so leading indicators as the metrics that drive behavior. So the State of DevOps report has been around for about 5 years now, right? 2013 inclusive set, 2017 is around the corner, so 5 years. And from that data, we've learned a lot about how IT industry performance plays out. And we've learned that there are certain measures around speed, efficiency, and risk that are correlated with how high-performing teams lead the industry and kind of leave the rest of their peers behind. At Chef, what we've done is we've adopted this data along with data that we've collected from our own users to derive a set of metrics that starts to create that cohesive web of practices. And it looks like this, right? So we organize the data in a pretty easy-to-follow prescriptive path. And the categories are measures of speed, efficiency, and risk. And you see metrics that define what high, medium, and low-performing organizations look like. Now, you might recognize some of this from the 2016 State of DevOps report. And then you might recognize the rest as some of the data around findings that were in that report that Chef has used in tandem with data that we know about our own users to derive some quantifiable measures for those findings. So there are a couple of things to note here and how the way that it all comes together. So those lines between high, medium, and low-performing organizations, those aren't arbitrary. It's not like somebody sat down and said, hey, this is what it means to be a high performer and this is what it means to be a medium performer. This isn't a prescription of the data, it's an interpretation of what was there. When you look at performance data points across the IT industry, they just sort of naturally organize into these clumps with very large performance gaps between them, right? So that's what you're seeing a reflection of in the chart. Two, the compliance automation data that we've gotten from the Chef community follows those same distinctions. And that kind of stands to reason because three, this is a cohesive web of practices. When you start to deliver on one of these metrics, it has a way of unpacking the others and bringing those practices with it. And so going back to the city example, right? It's not that the number of open air markets per square mile is what transforms your city. It's that measuring the number of open air markets per square mile signals that that's important, right? It lets diverse groups like investors, developers, permit issuers, and merchants know that they should be working together to create livable spaces. So let's see how that plays out in technology terms, right? We're going to take that one metric, time from commit to deploy, right? So if you are an organization that does quarterly releases, for example, this metric measures the average for every commit that you've had and how long it took to run in production. So if you release quarterly, that means some commits were made months before it was deployed, and maybe some commits were made minutes before deployment, right? But the only way that that's going to add up to an average that's measured in minutes is if you change how you develop features, right? You have to start developing features in small batches, which means that you need to rethink your development process, right? Maybe you need to launch features dark behind a feature flag until you have enough of them queued up in production that you can turn the whole thing on. And if you change that development method, then you need to change how development progress is measured. And if you change how development progress is measured, well, then you should probably change how your projects are managed. And if you change how your projects are managed, then you should rethink how objectives are set. And if you're rethinking how objectives are set, then you're probably in a position to reanalyze how business decisions are made and fed through, right? And so now what you have is a situation where that one change in engineering rippled all the way through up to the executive stack and affects everyone in between and aligns them in the same direction, right? That's what these metrics are for, and that's why they're leading indicators of change. And then once you're there, right, in order to keep that metric of being able to deliver changes to production in minutes, you probably need some sort of deployment pipeline, so you start delivering on those metrics of speed. And if you're deploying automatically, you probably need a series of tests. You start going down the path of test-driven development if you weren't there already, which leads to delivering on measures of efficiency and risk. And this is how this becomes this self-reinforcing web of behaviors that all have a way of reinforcing one another. And the thing about these metrics, right, is that they don't prescribe exactly which tool to use or which management method to follow, right? It decentralizes knowledge because it conveys what the priorities are, and the priorities in this case are shipping software faster, safer, more reliably. And it decentralizes the knowledge, right, because it communicates to everyone what the goals are, what the metrics are that they need to optimize for. And what it does is, to your teams, that grants autonomy, it grants ownership, it grants them trust, and it gives them direction to know what things you want them to deliver, right? And so rather than defining tens of dozens or hundreds of metrics that prescribe everything along the way, instead we focus only on those leading indicators that tell us we're moving in the right direction. So tell me how you measure me, and I will tell you how I behave. I like to take that a step further and say, tell me what all the measures are, and I will tell you how the organization behaves. I like to think that I'm clever and I came up with that, but it turns out it's really just the theory of constraints. So start with a holistic set of measurements and align interests across diverse teams. So that's great, George, but like, where do I take that? What do I do with that in my own organization? Do I just take those metrics and focus only on those? Maybe, I mean, they're a pretty good place to start, but maybe you care about managing other things in your organization, right? Like maybe managing WIP limits, right? Work in progress is important to you because, you know, that's how you maintain sanity on your development teams. Well, then what do you do? How do you work that in? Like, what are the indicators you should be looking for in that regard? So trial and error is really useful when we don't know where we're going. And I think there's very common advice in DevOps, which is experiment and fail quickly. And that's really good advice. And in fact, that's great advice when developing software features and giving them to users. And that's great advice in that respect because you can do things like A/B testing, you can see which features are being used and which aren't. But when we're talking about changing human behavior, that's a little bit of a slower process, right? The thing about failing quickly is that you have to be able to get feedback quickly. That's the only way you know if it succeeded or failed. And when it comes to altering behaviors, right, first the behavior has to be understood, and then it has to be implemented, and then you have to wait a while to see whether or not that actually had any effect. And then maybe you realize that the behavior was actually not implemented correctly, and you have to go back and iterate, change the way that your teams work, and that is fundamentally a slow process. Those feedback loops are pretty long by nature, and so you need to be really careful when you start going down that path, right? You need a little bit more than just, hey, let's try it and see what works. And this next part, like this part isn't by the numbers, because the numbers for why transformation fail are fuzzy at best. And I think that's for a couple of reasons, right? Either organizations don't fully understand why things failed or they're still experimenting, or two, I think sometimes organizations are a little reticent to share exactly why they failed and how they failed, Although DevOps, right? Sharing is caring. There's no learning without sharing. But what I will say, right, is that at Chef, we see this happen a lot, right? Where people start experimenting down the path of what's going to work. This was referred to as DevOps awakening in the keynotes, right? So I reuse that term here. But that part where teams start experimenting with trial and error to figure out how they take practices they've heard about and how those fit into their own organizations, we like to call that the operating chasm, right? This is when folks sometimes take the road less traveled, right? And decide, hey, I'm going to have that can-do determinism and just try to see if this thing works, right? I'm going to try something different. And when you try something different, like maybe you build the flux capacitor, maybe you built the brainwave analyzer instead, who knows, right? And we hear stories that go both ways. But what's really common here is that when you get into that operational chasm, what happens is you start thrashing on tool chain choices, you start thrashing on workflow decisions, right? Maybe start thrashing on organizational team structures. And it's very common to have a lot of failures because that's part of the trial and error process. So this learning curve has some cliffs, right? And it's definitely easy to fall off into the chasm. And even though we don't understand why those failures occur, you can definitely see that they occur in the data, right? The data reflects this. And if you were looking at the chart earlier, there are these weird little stats for medium performers. And so medium performers are basically DevOps awakened teams that started down the path of trial and error. And if you look at their performance for failure rates, right, they're higher than their low-performing counterparts. And when things fail, they're not necessarily any faster at recovery than their low-performing counterparts either, right? Like we see that when you start down that path, there's definitely a lot of potential to fall into that dip. So what are you telling me, George, right? Are you telling me not to experiment? No, like I am not telling you that at all. It's important to experiment, right? That's the only way that we learn, and that's the only way that we go forward. But what I am saying is that we need to compensate for those very long feedback loops so that we can avoid the potential pitfalls, right? And in doing so, that's where it's important to trust systems that we already know work. So experimenting is basically the scientific method, right? And the scientific method works because we establish a hypothesis before we start the experiment, right? And then we go ahead and start the experiment, make some measures, right, and figure out whether or not it worked. But if your experiment is going to run long, it's important to make as sharp of a hypothesis as you can because you're going to be living with this experiment for a long time. And the best hypotheses start not only with an understanding of the world around you and what some of those patterns are and questions, and luckily in DevOps, I think we have a lot of empirical data and some very common patterns to follow. But the best hypotheses also start with an understanding of your current empirical state, right? Like how do you measure where you are today? Because that's the only way you can figure out like if it worked or not, right? What is the delta? What is the difference? You can't know where you're going if you don't know where you are, right? And so how exactly to gather that data and put together a really sharp hypothesis is a little beyond the scope of this talk. But if you really want to get into it, just like find me later and buy a beer and like, hey, let's chat. But I will say this, right? When you start developing a hypothesis like this for, hey, what's going to work in my organization, don't just adopt a practice that you heard in a talk or something that you read in a white paper, right? Or don't just adopt this new tool because you know it works in other settings. You need to have a stronger filter around what the context is and how that will play out for your organization. And it's really important to develop that. But if you're just getting started, right, the question becomes, well, how do I develop a really good filter? So I'm going to turn to Nathan Harvey for this one, who turned me on to the concept of shuhari. Shuhari is a portmanteau of 3 words, shu, ha, and ri. It's a Japanese martial arts concept that starts with shu, right, which means whenever you're learning a new system or process, start with the fundamentals, right? Follow the traditional wisdom. And then once you've followed the traditional wisdom, then you get to ha, right? Once those basics are understood, you can then break with tradition and forge your own path. That leads to the ri, right? Once you've done that, then you can go, you're in a place where you have mastered the art. So if you're just getting started, what I'm saying is follow the known path, right? Establish the basics, and then you're in a better position to start filtering context and figuring out which of those hypotheses will work for you or not. So start by taking the road more traveled. Tools and behaviors, right? So we talked about how we align objectives across a number of teams by using metrics, but how do we reinforce that on a day-to-day basis, I love this quote from Adam Jacob, right? The tools we use reinforce the behavior reinforces the tools. So if you want to change behavior, change your tools. I like to take that a step further and say you can't change culture directly, but you can change behavior, right? Certain tools enforce certain behaviors, and those certain behaviors are what become your culture. And we kind of saw that play out in how two-way streets work, right? Like you change daily habits of how people get around, and eventually that leads you to a walkable culture. And it's the same thing in IT, right? The role of tools is important in your choices, but that's not to say that tools should drive your choices, right? The key is to pick a set of tools that make you work in ways by default that reinforce those desired behaviors, right? And those desired behaviors should work in tandem with the metrics that you've identified. So tools reinforce the behaviors deliver on those metrics, right? And those metrics are what shape your outcomes. And that's kind of the way that it all comes together. So what are those tools? I think there's a detail that's pretty often missed whenever we talk about Chef Automate. And that detail is the philosophy behind why Chef Automate is structured the way that it is. Right? Chef Automate has the 3 open source projects, Inspect, Habitat, and of course Chef, right, our namesake. And those are all pretty flexible automation frameworks that allow you to solve problems in a variety of different ways. But Chef Automate, the commercial platform, is really opinionated about how those all come together. And it's really opinionated about how those all come together because as a platform, the design principle behind Chef Automate is to create a tool set that changes the daily behaviors of how your teams operate in ways that deliver on proven industry metrics that lead you to success. So what are those metrics, right? We saw some of those, I think, in the keynotes this morning, right? Speed, efficiency, and risk. And when we start talking about how to hunker down and make changes in any of these areas, usually when I talk to teams about this, everybody wants to focus on speed, right? Go faster, faster, faster. And we can drive faster, right? But if we don't have a set of guardrails, we might potentially end up in a ditch. And when we start talking it through and figuring out what really matters, most folks realize they probably want to start by mitigating risk. And when you start by mitigating risk, then you start delivering on some of the factors behind service efficiency, and then that usually leads you down the path of speed. So let's look at them in that order. There's been a lot of talk on the main stage about compliance automation. Hopefully you've been able to attend one of the Inspect talks. I believe that track is still going, and there are a few left today if you haven't made it yet. But on stage, Carmen Kruger from SAP referenced the tension between development and security, right? Are you constantly trading off between speed and risk? And the problem here is that your development posture and your information security posture in most organizations are just diametrically opposed, right? In a continuous delivery world, all change is managed as code, so your development posture is all about test-driven development, right? Whereas most information security tools just simply aren't designed with continuous delivery in mind, right? They posture around binders of policy and manual processes, right, and filling in checklists of results. But Inspect allows information security teams to orient around enabling speed with automation, right? And so Inspect allows information security to meet developers where they already are, right? Which is code-driven continuous delivery that uses packs of easily distributed, versioned, executable tests that can plug into any test-driven development workflow, right? And so that one shift allows both your information and your development teams to align in the same direction, although there's definitely a lot more to that subject. It's a pretty dense subject, and if you want to get into the full-length dissertation, I put together a 19-page white paper on it that we just published today. So check it out, or if you just want to talk about it again, hey, let's talk after this and grab a beer. Tooling around efficiency, right? Tooling around efficiency means looking at service stability. And in order to ensure service stability, you need visibility into all of the things that are happening with those underlying layers of automation. So that's what some of the changes are that you've seen to Chef Automate on the main stage, right? You need to find the data that you need depending on your function in an organization. So this is why Chef Automate provides views around what's happening with your nodes, right? If you're an infrastructure person that cares about the state of your infrastructure, or compliance-based views. So if you care about the state of information security and what's happening across your organization, you can easily see those errors bubble up to the surface. And when you do see that issues bubble up to the surface, you need to be able to respond to them quickly, right? And if you started to mitigate issues of risk using automated compliance tests, you can start also deploying remediations very quickly when you identify that those issues have arisen, right? And this leads to things like the detect and correct cycle using inspec and chef client, and you can start seeing how this starts leading into that cohesive web of practices. I don't know what happened there. There we go. My clicker is not working. There we go, speed. So this is the one that folks usually care about, right? And so I'll talk about this quickly. The Chef Automate workflow, I think, reinforces the need for basic things like source control, right? Code reviews, test-driven development, dependency management, separation of duties, et cetera. SAP did a really great talk on using workflow yesterday, so I think that's a great way to reference it. Instead here, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Habitat build service that was in the keynote. So the Habitat build service, even though it's slightly future-facing vision, is basically still addressing the same basic needs, right? Except risk, right? Making sure that you're in compliance and that you aren't, I guess, exposed to vulnerabilities. Along with efficiency, right? Having proper testing, all of that has been automated in the process instead. Instead of doing things manually step by step as you are in today's current workflow, right? We've just codified those existing behaviors and made them automatic. You still have to manually promote artifacts from acceptance into production, but otherwise it just codifies those common behaviors. I'm looking at the clock and I'm almost out of time, so I was going to talk about some of the flexibility to maintain visibility or new vision and learning and make a joke about space bears. But now the time pressure is on and my speaker notes literally say joke about space bears here, so I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up instead. So from a tooling perspective, right, the requirement is to weave together a cohesive set of practices that align the working habits of diverse teams into that, that cohesive protection against unintended consequences. So the fundamental philosophy of Chef Automate is to do that by default so that you don't have to do it, right? You don't have to think about managing it. It just happens for you automatically, and this is the default way that you work. So the way to succeed in transformation is to set up those self-reinforcing cycles, right? And again, you do that by one, focusing on the metrics that matter for your organization, and two, putting tools in place that reinforce those behaviors on a daily basis. Setting up those self-reinforcing cycles is how you distribute expertise, right? And how you align the needs of teams with different needs and different goals to optimize around the same set of outcomes. So reinforcing those behaviors with tooling choices then turns those daily behaviors into what eventually becomes your culture, and that's the type of approach that scales across even the largest, most distributed groups. So thank you, and that's our time.